If I had a nickel for every ostensibly odd missing persons case in the state of Pennsylvania, I'd have actually nearly $1, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened something like 39 times. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Ledge. If you're interested in true crime, unsolved disappearances, or even the paranormal, there's a good chance that you're familiar with a concept known as Missing 411. Coined by author and former police officer David Paulides, the term refers to a victim profile describing some 1,200 and counting missing persons cases with strange attributes. In the most mysterious of these, people disappear and are never seen again, while in others they're either found deceased or otherwise unable to account for what happened to them. What ties them all together is a lack of information, Missing 411, missing information, regarding how and why they vanished, as well as a number of unique characteristics regarding both the identity of the victim and the circumstances of their disappearance. Specifically, Paulides selects cases wherein a majority of the following items are true. 1. The case took place in a rural setting. 2. Dogs were somehow involved in the disappearance. 3. Bloodhounds could not or would not follow a scent. 4. The subject was disabled or impaired in some way. 5. The subject, if found, had a fever. 6. The subject was found in a conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious state. 7. Law enforcement considered foul play. 8. The disappearance happened in the afternoon, often between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock p.m. 9. The subject was found in a swamp or briar patch. 10. The subject disappeared near or was found near a berry bush. 11. The subject's clothing had been removed. And 12. The subject was found in a previously searched area. Obviously, there's a lot that could be said about several of those points, but the point of this video is not to disparage David Paulides. It is to take a look at a group of disappearances that are said to be peculiar and determine what really happened to these individuals. And while I often do disagree with David, there have been a number of times where I felt he was right to say that things didn't quite add up. But there's more to it than just individual disappearances. Along with the shared details, Paulides has also identified a number of regions of the United States and Canada where this happens at a higher rate than it should, often located in or near national parks. But not all of these clusters, as he calls them, are restricted to federally managed lands. For example, according to Paulides, there have been at least 39 unexplained disappearances in the state of Pennsylvania since 1882. And what makes the Keystone State so unique is that almost all of them were children. In particular, the author notes that Pennsylvania had more children disappear from 1934 to 1957 than any other state, and that Pennsylvania has had more children under the age of 10 disappear than any other state or province, though he likely means this with regard to those that fit Missing 411 profile points. I do apologize for the tone of my voice and the breathlessness in this video. I am sick. Paulides also points to an 11-year gap in cases between 1957 and 1968, after which, according to him, the profile of people who went missing in Pennsylvania changed. They got older. And all of this has led him to believe, as he says, that something very peculiar was happening in Pennsylvania in the early to mid-1900s, based on the observation that the factors behind each disappearance were quite similar and the geographic proximity to each other should not be ignored. And it's that point that I'd actually like to touch on first, because Pennsylvania has some interesting geography. Broadly, the state of Pennsylvania can be broken into 5 or 6 regions, which may surprise those unfamiliar with the scale of the Commonwealth. Though we're all familiar with how important the Keystone State has been for the political history of America, and with the legendary sports teams of our 2 major cities, people are often caught off guard by how large Pennsylvania actually is. And I feel one way to illustrate this is to point out that the shortest highway route between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, those 2 largest cities, is a 5-hour, 305-mile journey, which takes travelers from the Delaware River across the Appalachian Mountains to within 30 miles of the West Virginia border. And from there, it's only a few more miles to Ohio. We actually drove this route a few months ago on our way down to Kentucky and then to Tennessee, and I will tell you, when you cross the PA border into West Virginia, you're kind of like, wow, this is so beautiful. And then the moment you hit Ohio, the depression is immense. I could actually feel a fog lift from my soul as we crossed the bridge into Kentucky from Cincinnati. But my point here is that that's quite a distance to take you across the breadth of one state, and it goes through several different types of landscape. And that's only covering the southern portion of the state, which is more populous but no larger than the northern half. All of this is to say that Pennsylvania, which would be the 98th largest country in the world by total land area if it were independent, is a bit too big to be called a cluster, at least for missing 411 purposes. Being a native of the region and having traveled extensively across it, I think it might be better to break it into a number of smaller clusters more in line with the geography of the states. And if we do that, Pennsylvania doesn't just have one cluster. It has 5 or 6, with varying numbers of cases in each area. But there's also another issue at hand with this. If you've seen our previous Missing 411 cluster series in the Great Smoky Mountains, you probably recall that a few of those cases weren't exactly as mysterious as they were made out to be, and as a result, the videos were pretty boring. On the other hand, there were a number of cases that, while they weren't necessarily paranormal seeming or unexplainable, definitely had some twists and turns. So to ensure that we don't waste any of your time on something that isn't actually intriguing, I decided to start this next series by triaging the cases first. All 39 or so. And while I was triaging all of those cases, one way that I got myself through it was by listening to music. And it's because of that love of music that I wanted to talk to you about today's sponsor, Raycon. Now, whether you like to listen to music while you work, while you're at the gym, or you're just, needing something that you can have to take phone calls while you're on the go, earbuds are one of the best ways to do it. And I actually remember my first pairs of earbuds from back in '05. Back then they were wired, they were clunky, they weren't exactly very high sound quality, and of course, they had to be plugged into the device. And then I remember when I was in high school, 10 years later, 2015 or so, we're starting to get the wireless ones, but they lasted 3 hours, the sound quality was garbage, and, well, they really didn't do much else. But in the last 10 years, the technology has really evolved quite a bit. You now have longer battery lives, you have active noise cancellation, and it's those premium features that you don't really expect from a lower priced brand. But with Raycon, that's exactly what you get. These earbuds have a 32-hour battery life. They have multi-point connectivity, and in my personal opinion, the best part is the active noise cancellation, which is almost impossible to find at an accessible price point. But with Raycon, you're getting all of those premium quality features for about half the price of a premium brand. Another nice thing about the everyday earbuds is that they're available in a variety of colors. And while I went with black, it's kind of a charcoal gray really, but I went with that because I like dark colors. But then I got this nice marble case that goes around it. You have all of these different customization options to really make your earbuds feel like yours. And if you have roommates, if you live with somebody, you have siblings, anything like that, easy way to make sure that you're not swapping earbuds and therefore earwax. Of course, for me, if I were to give a personal endorsement, it would really be around that active noise cancellation. I get distracted so quickly by background noise, so the ability to just filter all of that out, especially when you have two lovable but very yappy dogs, is just so nice. One other really nice thing about these guys is that they do have wireless charging capability, so you don't even have to worry about plugging them in. You don't need to drag a cord along with you everywhere you go. Then again, how often are you going to need to charge something that lasts 32 hours? I think it's pretty clear that I really genuinely do like this product. I think it is a great value at the price point. So if you would like to try it for yourself, you can go to buyraycon.com/lorelodge to get 15% off site-wide. So that's not just the everyday earbuds, that's site-wide. To be very clear here, you'll get 15% off everything on Raycon's website when you go to buyraycon.com/lorelodge. When I first started looking at the Pennsylvania cluster, one of the first things I noticed was, this is a lot of cases. This is a lot of cases. But I also didn't want to end up in a situation where we were doing entire videos on cases that didn't have anything particularly strange involved. So the first step was to go through and say, all right, which of these cases can be explained off the bat as something mundane? Not necessarily that there is full proof that nothing strange happened, but that there is a more plausible explanation than aliens or portals or Bigfoot or any of the things that David Paulides never explicitly says it was, but heavily implies were involved. I want to make it clear that I am not really a skeptic. My goal isn't to disprove anything that isn't normal. I am very interested in the supernatural. I am very interested in the paranormal and these varying ways in which we try and make sense of the things that we don't understand. But partially due to my experience, getting things wrong, I like to operate on the premise that you need to eliminate everything that is possible before you consider the things that seem impossible. And I think that this is a very important step, especially when dealing with the missing 411 phenomenon. So the first cases that I want to go through in this cluster are the ones that are not as weird as you think. The first case Paulides presents in the Pennsylvania section of Missing 411 Eastern United States is the story of a boy identified only as the 10-year-old son of a wealthy farmer named George Wolfe, who disappeared on July 8, 1882. As the narrative supplied in the book goes, the Wolfe family lived 3 miles east of Girard Manor in the Catawissa Valley of Pennsylvania, a rugged and sparsely populated area about 7 miles southwest of Hazleton. The family's piece of property was surrounded by a high fence, which, according to a July 16th article from the Philadelphia Times, had been built specifically for the child's protection. The 10-year-old was a deaf mute and would thus be very difficult to find should he get lost. It might be worth mentioning that throughout this cluster, the term deaf mute actually ends up being used quite a few times. Given the age of these cases, it's hard to say what kind of disability we're dealing with here exactly. Some of these could simply be that the child was deaf and never learned to speak as a result, but I think knowing what we know today, it's also important to consider the possibility of nonverbal autistic children, because that in and of itself could factor into some of the things that make these stories weird. Remember that somebody being special education, special needs, things like that, 50 to 100 years ago can often appear differently in the writing of the time. So with that in mind, on the afternoon that the boy went missing, the fence was left open, and one can reasonably assume that the Wolfe boy wandered out that way. 25 people searched for him the first day, and then by the 6th day, the effort had grown to 10 times that number. Somewhat miraculously, George Wolfe himself found his son sitting on a rock 5 miles from his farm, alive but in less than stellar condition after nearly a week without shelter. According to the Times, he was weeping bitterly and suffering great pain from innumerable bites when he was rescued, and he was chewing on a piece of tree bark. Oddly, articles from before July 22nd, and they were all basically the same wording, closed with the statement that he cannot recover, but articles published on or after the 22nd do not include that last sentence. Now, there's no direct statement from Paulides regarding why this case is strange or why it fits with the missing 411 profile to which all of these disappearances are supposedly linked. But if we look at the story, the setting was indeed rural, the subject was disabled, he went missing in the afternoon, and he was found in a semi-conscious, conscious, or unconscious state. But that's only 4 out of 12 markers, and one of them is just, he was alive. Paulides does say that the searchers traversed swamps, which was another profile point, but none of the articles mention that part. And while there are some marshy spots up in the Poconos, they don't exactly dominate the landscape. Now, the clothing aspect could be an argument, as the boy was only wearing a nightshirt, but we don't know what he was wearing to begin with, and therefore we can't say that he undressed himself. Other than that, there really aren't any further matches, and realistically, this case just isn't all that strange. A 10-year-old boy who can't hear or speak left the yard through an open fence, got lost, and then survived on tree bark and stream water for 6 days. That said, I can sort of see where David was coming from when he included this, given that it does fit several of his profile points in his opinion, but I do think that the evidence this is strange is still very weak. Now, to his credit, the next several in the book are actually somewhat intriguing, potentially very intriguing, but I'll get to that in a bit. The next one that's on our not as weird as you think list, however, is that of Geraldine Markline, a 2-year-old girl who vanished in the Pigeon Hills area outside of Hanover, part of Pennsylvania's historic Amish country. And little known fact, but Archie here, his breed is an Amish dog. He's an American Eskimo Spitz. Yeah, he was brought over here by some German dudes a long time ago. He's so good. He's so good. Settled by Germanic immigrants of the Mennonite Anabaptist tradition in the early 18th century, the core of Pennsylvania Dutch country spans a massive swath of territory from the western edges of the Five Counties region, where Thornbury and I currently are, to the Appalachian Ridge outside of Gettysburg. A place caught between two times, the people of Lancaster, York, and the surrounding areas share streets with both cars and horse-drawn buggies, creating a very interesting atmosphere. It's the kind of place where you'll be in a store and some guy in a Saquon Barkley jersey, 5-inch inseam cut-off jean shorts, boots, a mullet, and a cigarette-flavored vape will be standing in line at the store next to an extra from Mel Gibson's The Patriot named Ezekiel Stoltzfus. Ezekiel is the best carpenter this side of the Mississippi and will die on the farm his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Stoltzfus settled in 1706. Eagles guy is named Andrew Donnelly and he's in consulting but balls out for the weekend. They politely hold the door open for one another on the way out. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. Anyway, Geraldine Markline disappeared on October 26, 1929, while her mother was out on business in Hanover. According to Paulides, she was last seen by her older brother Luther, who took his little siblings outside to watch them while he raked leaves. Luther put Geraldine down in a seated position in the backyard under a large tree and told her to stay put while he ran inside to get something to eat. After a very short time, Paulides writes, Luther returned and found that Geraldine was missing. The children and Luther searched for their sister but could not find her. Then, when their mother came home, they told her what happened, and she contacted the police. Now, as is common in tight-knit farming communities, Amish or otherwise, dozens of people turned out to search for the missing 2-year-old. The next day, when she still hadn't turned up, the Pittsburgh Gazette reported that while some feared that an abandoned water-filled quarry near her home held her body, and her father thinks the child kidnapped, thousands of persons last night scoured the Pigeon Hills in hopes of finding a trace of Geraldine Markline. Thankfully, the search was brought to a swift and happy end on the 28th, when searchers about 1.5 miles from the Markline residence found Geraldine in a place called Miller Keeby Woodlot. She was doing just fine, the York Dispatch reporting that the experience apparently was not a terrifying one for Geraldine, who laughed as she was taken to her anxious parents. But regarding the circumstances of her disappearance, Paulides writes, imagine thousands of searchers scouring a very confined area for a missing 2-year-old child. A child who can't run, can barely walk, and the searchers are finding nothing. This is another case, he writes, in which the parents know their child, they know how far she can travel, and they start to believe that searchers are not finding her in an area where she should be located, so they conclude that she must have been kidnapped. Now, I don't like to just point out logical fallacies as an argumentation style, but this is just an argument from incredulity. When a young child disappears from an area that people would think she couldn't travel out of, considering a kidnapping is a perfectly logical next step. Also, the Pittsburgh Gazette had their numbers off. According to the much more local York Dispatch, the search party numbered only 175. So with the revised number, the whole thing suddenly looks a lot less mysterious. Fact of the matter is, a 2-year-old can wander 1.5 miles in 2 days, and if she stays dry, she can stay warm. She'll be hungry, but she won't starve. So taken as a whole, this is a 2-year-old child who wandered off while her brother wasn't paying attention, was in the woods for a couple of days, and came out alive. The next on the list in this segment is Donald Farrington, whose case is basically the same as Geraldine's. It was also up in Holland, New York, which is closer to Buffalo than it is to Pennsylvania. The 3-year-old was last seen walking towards the family barn by his father on September 11, 1938, and after that a search was launched, and Donald was found early the next morning in a berry patch 2 miles from his farm. He was a bit scratched up, but otherwise fine. Another similar case occurred in October of 1940 in Shepton, Pennsylvania, 174 miles to the southeast. 4-year-old Rudy Kunchick had been watching his father screen coal when he disappeared, according to David Paulides, and a little over 2 days later, searchers found him lying under a rock overhang, and he came out when he heard them calling his name. David's reasoning for including this was that the dogs couldn't track his scent, and that the area was heavily wooded. Now, if we are seeking a possible explanation before we look at the impossible, we have to recognize that search dogs aren't perfect, and kids have a lot of energy. There's a very plausible answer here, so it's odd to jump to this kind of a conclusion. Once again, the most likely answer here is this is a young child who just wandered off. I do wonder a little bit if David being more of a city guy has anything to do with his belief that these aren't explainable.
City boy! City boy!
Yet another Why Is This Here case comes with the May 1941 disappearance of Eldridge Albright, a 3-year-old from Woodstock, Maryland. Now, looking at this story, we're actually closer to Baltimore than we are to Pennsylvania, but long story short, Eldridge was playing in a creek bed 300 yards behind his house with 2 family dogs. His grandmother was on the porch when she heard him scream, and she followed the screams towards the creek. After following the creek for a little while, she came across one of the dogs, but it wouldn't budge from where it stood, looking off towards the screaming boy. She came home and called the authorities, a search was launched, and then, after a little over a day of searches, a team heard someone whimpering from under a rock ledge about 4 miles from the family home. It was Eldridge, and while his clothes were a little bit torn up, he was otherwise fine. Asked where he'd been, he said Twains, alluding to the nearby train tracks. So, what do we have here? Child went looking for trains and got lost. Not really the place for this story. Could it be weird that he screamed? Yes. Are there a lot of mundane things that could cause a 3-year-old boy to scream? Also, yes. Like I said, just not really the place for this story. The same is true of Betty Bossier, who went missing from outside of Altoona, Pennsylvania on June 24th, 1941. She was playing on a neighboring farm when she wandered off, and then was found a day later sitting on a rock in dense brush in the woods surrounding the farm. Paulides notes that canines did not find the girl, asking why can't canines seem to track the missing people that are written about in these books? And Aiden, if you could just place the definition of selection bias on the screen. Joseph Prato's case can be summed up as 19-month-old child ends up a little farther away than you might expect. The boy was found 2 miles from his home at Bald Eagle Mountain on October 26, 1941. He was missing for less than 24 hours, and the lowest temperature he had to deal with was about 50 degrees. It was apparently odd that he was found asleep at noon. By the way, he was totally fine, like completely untraumatized, no serious physical harm, just lost. An almost identical case unfolded the following year when 3-year-old Alvan Diggan, or Duggan, vanished from a strawberry patch about a mile from his Montgomery, Pennsylvania home. He was found 2 days later in a pine grove 2 miles away. He was naked and sobbing, but otherwise he was fine, so this case can be summed up as child wanders off, is found. 4 years later, in 1946, Eugene Shue went missing from his home near Mannheim. His mother fed him a sandwich at noon, and then he and the dog went missing while she was out running an errand. You may notice a number of similarities to the Geraldine Markline case here, including Amish country. Anyway, searchers found the kid the next day in the woods 4 miles away at Cornell Lookout, the highest mountain in the area, according to David Paulides. Now that might sound impressive if you're not aware that the elevation change between the farmland and the lookout is about 600 feet. One potentially weird aspect of this could be that the dog was never found, but that tells us that the most likely explanation for how Eugene went missing is that the dog ran off, Eugene chased the dog, Eugene got lost, and then Eugene got found. Where'd the dog go? Who knows? It's a dog. It could have stayed alive in the wilderness for many years. It could have been adopted by another farmer. It could have had something bad happen. Although, if it was the same breed as Archie, which, as I said earlier, is an American Spitz, brought here by the Amish, I don't think it would have done very well in the wild. I mean, does this look like the kind of thing that could take care of itself in the wilderness? Hi, hello, hi, okay, come here. He wouldn't do well. He is baby. He is baby. Another such incident occurred in 1949 when 3-year-old Billy Clever disappeared while helping his mother pick mushrooms. Rude. As I was saying, Billy Clever disappeared while helping his mother pick mushrooms near their Mercersburg home. His mother lost sight of him, went home, retrieved her 15 other children, and proceeded to launch a search. He was found 3 miles away the next morning by a volunteer, his clothes torn up, but he was physically just fine. He did run from the rescue worker, but he was a toddler and could have just been afraid of the strange man, so this doesn't really pass muster as a mysterious occurrence. I think the biggest mystery here is how Mrs. Clever managed 16 children. 16 children! Doing some quick math, that is 12 years of pregnancy. Unless some of them were twins, but still, sheesh. Moving along to a case that is closer to Washington, D.C. than it is to Pennsylvania, 6-year-old Otis T. Mason vanished from his Colesville, Maryland home on October 11th, 1949. And sadly, this case actually does not have a happy ending. Otis was unfortunately found in a creek 2 miles from home after he was last seen chasing after his dogs. The dogs returned some hours later, but Otis did not, and it follows that he slipped and drowned while he was chasing them. David does bring up one interesting point, which is that one of the dogs was found alive in an empty septic tank with the lid closed. Now, of course, the lid being closed would imply that someone put the dog in there. However, I could not find a single source which reported that the lid was closed. And a dog can fall into an empty tank and get stuck. So if the lid is open, there's no reason to assume that someone placed the dog in there. If a reliable source were to turn up that shows that the septic tank's lid was in fact on, I would definitely move this more into the weird category, though. Now, one case from amongst these that did make my jaw drop a little bit was that of Jackie Copeland, who disappeared from a company picnic near Pleasantville on May 14th, 1950. And David's account of the child being found goes as follows. At 8 o'clock a.m. the morning following Jackie's disappearance, a man named Bossier was searching outside of the main area in a location where an oil repressuring plant was located. The area is completely surrounded by what many newspaper articles called impassable swamps. As Mr. Bossier and a crew of searchers were walking through the swamps, he accidentally saw Jackie looking around from the side of a tree, almost peering. Bossier called his name, and Jackie answered. Jackie was found over 2 miles from the picnic and across swamps that were deemed impassable by search coordinators. Now, I do want to point out that if this Bossier fellow was passing through the swamps, they were by definition not impassable. But the jaw-dropping part is this one right here, because David goes on to quote the Logansport Press, a paper out of Indiana, as reporting that the child told investigators he saw something peering at him from behind a big tree, and that when he approached, the creature scampered into the brush. Sounds very sinister, right? Well, the problem is that Jackie didn't say that. The guy who found him did, according to the much more local Altoona Tribune, as well as literally every other paper I found. The creature that scampered off after peering behind the tree, that was Jackie. Bossier was describing the moment of seeing Jackie. He literally said so. I have to be honest, David's portrayal of this is such a blatant misrepresentation of what the actual source material says that I have a hard time believing it was not deliberate. But all of that said, there is one interesting aspect here, which is that the child recounted in Child Talk his adventure in an awful blackness, peopled by a great throbbing giant and a tall friendly tree, and wild animals howling in the distance and the unfamiliar shouts of strangers prowling nearby. The animals can be explained as animals and the shouts as searchers, but the throbbing giant gives me pause, and not just because I really don't like the use of the term throbbing here. Talking trees, as we know, are our allies against the fires of Isengard. Now, as for why I put this in the not weird category, given the mention of the throbbing giant, if Jackie were like 10 to 15 years old, I would say that's weird. In fact, if he were like 5 to 10 years old, I'd say that's weird. But Jackie was 2 and had an incredibly limited vocabulary. It would be one thing if Jackie said a large, hairy man took me into a cave, fed me raw meat, and then deposited me by the repressuring plant. But that's not what Jackie said. In fact, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what Jackie said because everything we got was being translated out of Child Talk and into adult English. Again, like this one I guess would be on the cusp of potentially weird for me, but there's just not enough there, and I did look for more about it. I just could not dig anything up. Unsurprisingly, when a child is recovered alive after a couple of days, everybody just kind of collectively breathes a sigh of relief about it and doesn't report further. And of course, this is where the whole cluster thing would come into play, but as you might be noticing, the clusters aren't quite as much of a cluster as they would otherwise seem. And from what I can tell, there really aren't any other stories of this kind from within, 10 miles of Pleasantville. So I guess, maybe it's fair to say this one could go either way. Next in the chronology of this doesn't seem like it should be in a Missing 411 book series, I guess, that we're doing here. 5-year-old Emma Bowers, who was found in July of 1953 eating berries 2 miles from her home overlooking the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad outside of Mill Run, Pennsylvania. She'd been missing for over 2 days and hadn't heard anyone searching because she too was a deaf mute. Now, she was found naked, but again, this is a 5-year-old. There are a number of reasons she might have deliberately taken off her clothes that aren't weird, especially if we consider that deaf-mute might apply to some other mental disabilities. So, is it a little weird that she was found naked? Potentially, but kids do like trains, so that explains her positioning, and kids also like berries, so that explains her being near berries. Is this a little weird? Yeah, sure, but is it paranormally or criminally weird? Not really. The next one on the list, Harold Mott, is another of the dog stories. The 12-year-old boy disappeared from his Corydon Township home on March 3rd, 1976, and if you're from Corydon or Corydon, however that's pronounced, it's the opposite side of the state. Go ahead and correct me, I won't be offended. Anyway, kid disappeared March 3rd, 1976. He told his family that he was going to look for the missing family dog, and then his brother and his neighbor went along with him. They ended up splitting up, and then Harold went on to remain missing for 3 days. He was eventually found 9 miles from his family's property, and he walked out to approach searcher Monty Edel. He had a walking stick and seemed to be in good health, and he even asked searchers if the dog had come home. Not only had she, but she'd done so the same night he had disappeared. After he was discovered, Harold followed the searchers back to the car and then just was brought home with no further fanfare about it, because he was alive. Also, he was 12. So all of that was Paulides' version of the narrative, which I will say the Kane Republican does, for the most part, corroborate. But in my opinion, Paulides left out the very best part. When Harold was found by the searchers and approached, he simply said, "Hi, boy am I glad to see you guys." In any case, David Paulides argues that this case is fascinating because 2 family members, keep in mind one of them was a dog, were missing at the same time under 2 separate incidents. Snowball had been missing for several days when Harold disappeared looking for the dog. The dog appears the same night that Harold goes missing. Quite a coincidence. I will say that it's certainly impressive that Harold made it, especially since he was listed as a special education student. So again, we don't know exactly what was up with him, but there was some disability here, and it's impressive that he made it no matter what. But I find it a little unfortunate that in service of preserving a sense of mystery, Paulides omitted the kid's explanation that he was in despair at times, but pushed through, drinking from creeks to sustain himself and crawling under things to keep warm as he slept. He was just lost. As for how he remained lost for so long, why he didn't come out to searchers, he told papers that he waved at search helicopters and that he did try to find the road, but also he was listed as a special education student. And, we don't know exactly what that means. This was 1976. What were his special needs? Could they have anything to do with why he remained missing for these several days? It's just there's not enough here to say, yeah, this is really weird. And I think what we're seeing with many of these cases is sort of a confirmation bias that, while they are grouped together somewhat locally, so they have to be connected. And I just don't think that that's a fair assessment given the details. And I think that's why we see over and over again that when you look at a case individually, it breaks down. It's often obvious what happened. One of the most obvious, yet also most tragic in this list is the story of John Dabkowski and Gabriel Minarcin. The 2 boys, 11 and 10 years old respectively, left Dabkowski's house at 5:30 p.m. on January 14th, 1981, to go to Marcin's house at 154 First Avenue in Tarentum, Pennsylvania. Now, these houses were basically across the street from each other. They were 137 and 154. We're talking probably 50 feet between doors. They were reported missing shortly after leaving Dabkowski's house, and upon questioning the neighbors, police learned that the boys had been playing out on the ice or had been seen playing out on the ice-covered Allegheny River around 5:45. Paulides writes that no breaks were found in the ice, but the Pittsburgh Press, which in this case was one of the local papers, reported on January 17, 1982 that searchers Friday night were led from the Dabkowski and Minarcin homes to a spot near a large break in the ice by bloodhounds. Tragic, but not a mystery. But here's the thing. The cases I just went through, that's just 13 of nearly 40 in the state of Pennsylvania. All the rest of them, there's something not quite right. For example, one girl's death was attributed to moon madness by the coroner after she was discovered in a Philadelphia park. In another, a Trenton area psychologist went off for a weekend trip to the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon, and somehow only 2 articles were ever written about it. They're both weird. There's potential murder mysteries, there's lovers' quarrels, and there are a couple that seem like the person was just sucked into another dimension. And it's those that we're going to be covering in detail as we make our way through the Pennsylvania cluster. And you know what that means? History segments are back. And speaking of history segments, just a sneaky little promo for our new show, History Unhinged. We have a new show called History Unhinged. It's me, Stephen Bell from History of Everything, and Roman Helmet Guy, with Thornbury sitting there as you. He's your surrogate. Not for pregnancy, but for questions. But before I wrap up this video, and then before we start looking into the other Pennsylvania cases, the ones that do seem odd, I want to give some thoughts on the Missing 411 profile points and also the series overall, after spending really the bulk of the last 3 years intensively studying it. You know, going through the profile points here that Paulides presents, and they have changed over time, some have been added, like for example, once the movies started coming out, there were these additional profile points that very often the subject is German in ancestry. German is the most common ancestry in the United States, so I think that might have something to do with that. Anyway, I'm going by the ones that are actually in Eastern United States here, that 2011 book. And if we start with that, then the first one on there is that the case took place in a rural setting. And I think that is the meat and potatoes of Missing 411, to be honest, is these rural disappearances that make them different from, well, obviously from urban ones, but when it's out in the middle of nowhere, it feels less likely somebody was just abducted by another person or murdered by another person. Whereas if you're dealing with, downtown Philadelphia and somebody just vanishes off a street corner, you're gonna lean more towards foul play off the bat. But the reason I say Philadelphia specifically here is that one of the cases that we're going to look at, which I want to say 100% is weird. Like, whether it's foul play or what, it is a weird case. But it takes place in Philadelphia in the 1930s, in Fox Chase. I mean, this was not a rural area. Was it as developed as it is now? No. Was it by any means the sticks? Absolutely not. In fact, we covered a case that happened in almost exactly the same spot about 25 years later when we covered The Boy in the Box. But for the most part, Missing 411 cases obviously do take place in rural settings, in national parks, in farming communities like you have Brandon Swanson. So yeah, that's a pretty legitimate one. I think it's a legitimate profile point to include. But then there's the dogs. And what the dogs mean has changed over time. In Eastern United States, the reason he includes dogs is, okay, dogs were involved in the disappearance in that the child or the person was last seen with a dog. Or they might have mentioned seeing a dog while they were out there. In my opinion, if the disappearance involves somebody chasing after a dog, that makes the disappearance less mysterious because it explains why they went missing. But I also think it's relevant to bring up the point that whether or not a dog is involved seems to be completely random in the sum total of Missing 411 cases. I can think of a lot more that didn't involve dogs than ones that do. The next one, of course, is that bloodhounds or other scent-tracking canines can or will not follow a scent, which can really, in a lot of cases, be attributed to the fact that they're just not perfect. Dog searches are an art, not a science. You can train them really well, but sometimes they're just not going to be able to do it. And Paulides often will say that, dogs couldn't follow the scent. That makes it weird in cases where there were heavy rains that would have washed away any scent. Yes, water actually can preserve a scent, but in the cases of things like light rain or fog or dew, torrential downpours wash a scent away. So dogs are at their most effective when there is, a little bit of moisture in the air, a little bit of moisture on the ground, but not too much or too little. Another profile point that I think sort of in a way contributes to making these stories less suspicious is that the subject is often disabled or impaired in some way. But then again, a lot of the time, the subject isn't. I mean, going back to the Great Smoky Mountains cluster, we had Trenny Gibson, we had Michael Aubrey, we had Larry Davenport, we had Michael Reel, Mark Hansen, Jeff Haig. I mean, I've gone through, that's a bunch of them. I'm not good at math. Anyway, I was counting on my fingers and I think I counted wrong and it confused me. Point is, the majority of the people in the Great Smoky Mountains cluster did not have disabilities of any kind. And if we're being realistic here, somebody having a disability like deafness makes it more likely that they would not be found for a legitimate mundane reason. If somebody had super hearing and somehow didn't hear the searchers, I'd be more confused than if somebody who is deaf isn't found. I mean, given that the thesis here of Missing 411 is that these are strange disappearances that are in some way connected, something that makes a disappearance less strange is a weird thing to select as a profile point. Another one on the list, the next one, is that the subject, if found, has a fever in many of these cases. But in many, yes, but not in a majority, not really in many that I can think of. I think Harold Mott was the one in this series that had a fever, and it was just Harold Mott. Just Harold. And he'd been in the woods for several days. He could have just been sick. It happens. The body, he might have had a minor infection. The fact that these things weren't reported in the papers doesn't mean that it's impossible they happened. If he had a minor, infected cut that was treated at the hospital, the doctor's gonna say he was in good condition. And then there's the next one, which is the one that I just had to laugh at, which is that the subject is found in a conscious or semi-conscious state. And of course, if you read the book and you read the explanation blurb at the beginning of the book about this profile point, Paulides goes on to mention that subjects are sometimes found unconscious. So one of the profile points is that the subject is found conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious, which would be alive. That those are just the three possible states of being alive. Or, in many cases, the subject is found not alive or not found, and all of these qualify as missing 411 cases. So this is not a point at all. The subject is found or not. Obviously, if the subject is found, he or she will be conscious, semi-conscious, unconscious, or dead. Those are the only options. This only makes sense if you leave one of them off the table. If every single person you include in your profile was semi-conscious, they were in a dazed state, that's interesting. That's something to look for. You can't just say the subject was in a state and leave it at that. Of course, the next one on the list is that law enforcement considered foul play, but in almost any missing persons case where foul play is a possibility, which is basically all of them at a certain point, law enforcement will eventually consider it. Really, the only times law enforcement won't consider foul play is if there's a note. And even when there's a note, law enforcement sometimes still considers foul play. But if there's evidence that somebody meant to disappear, they're gonna wait a while to consider it. My point is, this kind of fits with the last one, just a missing persons case. Chances are it will eventually, if it remains unsolved, be considered a possible foul play case. Foul play is usually one of those things that isn't considered because of something, it's considered because it hasn't been ruled out yet. Now, I will say that the next one on the list, which is that the disappearance occurs in the afternoon, often between 2 and 5 p.m., that to me is one of the more legitimate profile points. That is distinct. It is not a majority of the time. We're not talking about, they only don't go missing between 2 and 5. That would mean they just go missing at some point in the day. Here we're talking about a discrete time period. I think that's fair. You can ask the question, what is it about the late afternoon that leads to people disappearing? Or at the very least, that correlates to people disappearing. The problem, of course, is a significant number of the cases in this book, in this series, don't involve the person disappearing between 2 and 5 p.m. Also, it could kind of be a, shark attacks and ice cream correlate situation. When are people most frequently out in the woods? And when are they most likely to be a little bit tired being out in the woods? Mid-afternoon. It's also when it's the hottest out in the summer, which can lead to dehydration. So does this one feel like a more reasonable point? Yes. Does it necessarily connect these disappearances? No, not really. Not on its own. We also have that the subject is found in a swamp or briar patch, or that the subject was found near or disappeared near a berry bush. Again, not enough. If you're gonna make that a profile point, it's gotta be a majority of the time. I mean, the thing about each of these profile points is that none of them seem to be true a majority of the time. So at that point, you're kind of just looking at a randomized scatter plot and deciding that you see a pattern. One of the other profile points is that the subject's clothing has often been removed. But then again, in many of these cases, the subject's clothing has not been removed. I will say it's definitely a much more frequent one within the Pennsylvania cluster, but so is the point that the subject is a child, and children are much more likely to remove their clothes than adults. And lastly, there is the point that the subject is found in a previously searched area, which is something I put a lot of stock into up until the point that we actually went on the ground in the Smokies. Now, I will say that in many cases, this actually is a good point. And it baffles me that people are found in some of these cases in the places they are, because it seems like if they were there the whole time, especially if it's somebody who's deceased in a small search area, it's hard to understand how they did not find this person. And it's those ones that I'm often interested in, those ones where, a child disappears for several hours and then reappears very close to where they were last seen and somehow it was missed. But also there are certainly areas of the country, there are terrain types where you might walk right past something and not realize it was there. And I do want to be clear as we go through this that my goal has never been to clown on David Paulides and make fun of the guy. When I started making content, I thought he was onto something. I genuinely believed that, and part of the reason I started making videos was because I wanted to show people that he was right, that something weird is going on. And I will say at this point, even though I'm going through these individually and seeing that most of them aren't that weird, I'm willing to change my opinion. If I start to see a pattern, I will change the opinion. And that's why I've been going through point by point, is to see, all right, well, maybe there is a pattern. Maybe he's just misidentified the clusters based on a bit of, confirmation bias. Because there are some missing 411 cases that I look at and I go, what happened here? How did we get here? But that number is not anywhere near a majority. That doesn't mean I'm going to stop looking, because it's certainly taken me to interesting places doing this. I have gotten more invested in the whole Sasquatch concept. I've done a little bit more looking into UFO encounters. There are, of course, the idea of, feral people that I think is very interesting and often lines up with a lot of Bigfoot stories. Those, of course, get less and less common into the modern day as society sprawls out more and more and there's fewer places that somebody could actually live going undetected. But I still think they're interesting stories and I love exploring them. And then, of course, like I said, every once in a while, David snags a story that I otherwise wouldn't have heard of, and it makes me scratch my head. So I'm very grateful to him for that. I've had a lot of people who are very pro-Paulides come into the comments section and criticize me and say, stop criticizing Paulides, you wouldn't have a platform without him. And you're right, yeah, I wouldn't. I would not have a career without David Paulides. That doesn't mean I can't criticize him. With the training I had in my education, one thing that we do a lot of, in the history field is a process called peer review, where you will have a group of historians take a look at one historian's work, whether that is a book, a dissertation, a journal article, something like that. Usually you'll have 3 or 4 other people who will then take a look at it, review it, and that's how you determine whether or not it gets published. It's also a way that you can give something credibility. If something is peer-reviewed and the reviews are all generally positive, then you look at that and you say, okay, this is a good entry into the body of work. So what I feel I'm doing with Paulides here is peer review. It is another person who studies the same kind of thing, going through, looking at the case and saying, all right, here's what I like and dislike about this other researcher, for lack of a better term, this other researcher's work. It's not supposed to be an insult. It's not supposed to be a negative necessarily. I might poke some fun here and there because, this is YouTube, not an academic journal. But my intention has never been to make a mockery of this man. I just honestly disagree with him. But for all of the honest disagreement, there are a few times where I think he's been, for the most part, right. And even in cases where he's like, this is weird, I might disagree with why it's weird, but I agree that it's weird. So all of that is to say that there's a reason I only put 13 of these 39 cases into the definitively not weird category and left the remaining 24 untouched. Because I'm going to spend a good amount of time over the course of this year going through those. Will they all get their own episode? Probably not. The ones that I look at and go, not as weird as I thought it would be, they might get wrapped up in towards the end. It's like, this is weird, but it's hard to say exactly why, and there wasn't a ton of information on it. Those might get wrapped up into the analysis episode at the end of the series. The ones I'm going to focus my attention on are the 22-year-old girl who went for a walk and then was heard, screaming, and her body was found by 2 boys who were in the park the same time she was the day before. Because personally, I find it really weird that a coroner, and in a big city that's supposed to be a medical examiner, I haven't confirmed it was yet, blamed moon madness. I find it odd that a Trenton area clinical psychologist attended a conference at Westchester University and then drove up to the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon only to disappear with his boots left in his car, as well as his open day pack. There's one story that is about a small child who disappeared and then said that he spent the night in a house, and then he was found just kind of asleep in a grove in the snow the next day, saying that he followed a man and a dog into the woods. There's a story of a 15-year-old girl who her mother heard her scream, couldn't find her, and then when she was found several days later, told her mother that she had been chased from the house by a big man with a knife. which you would think would lead to people saying this was probably foul play and there's a crazy man with a knife around, only for the police to then go, well, she told us that, she was fine and there was nothing weird that happened. It's not foul play, don't worry about it. In that case, Paulides actually says, remember, the police were absolutely adamant at the start of this investigation that Karen had been kidnapped, and then they completely reversed course. I think he's right to question that. I mean, in this case, when the police find her, after thinking she must have been kidnapped, they say that she told them that she had been nervous and high-strung lately and had decided to take a walk in the woods to get away from it all. And then she tells her mother she was chased by a big man with a knife. Something's not right there. And I don't know a single girl who has ever described herself as nervous and high-strung. Like, I look at that, and to me, that sounds like the police describing her as nervous and high-strung, and her not doing that. But of course, I gotta look into it more. And that's what the rest of the series is gonna be. So I hope that us going through these 13 that weren't actually weird and saying these weren't actually weird hasn't turned you off to the genuine mysteries that we're about to go through. But if you did enjoy this video and you do enjoy our work, then you can support us here at the Lore Lodge by subscribing to us on Patreon. It is $1 a month and it gets you access to exclusive content such as Liquored Lore, or here on YouTube, you can become a member of the channel. It is also $1 a month. There are higher tiers on Patreon. They get you some gifts like mugs, posters, and whatnot. We also have merch from Tableau Roasting Company and Bunker Branding. Tableau Roasting Company is coffee. You can't wear it, but you can drink it. Bunker Branding is merchandise. It is clothing. You can wear it, but you can't drink it. You might be able to, but I wouldn't. Not recommended. Not the recommended use, sir. You can also keep up with what we're doing by hitting the notification bell here on this channel, or more importantly, joining our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge, where you will get all the updates as soon as the updates are updated. And if you're looking for more Lodge, you can get it by going to the Weird Bible here on YouTube, or History Unhinged, our new show. And then, of course, we have 2 other channels with partners. Those are Off the Record with Luke Eccles and Boozy Mixologist. Last Call Lounge with our buddy Celso, who is a phenomenal bartender. I'd also like to thank Raycon once again for sponsoring this video. It was very kind of them. And last but most certainly not least, we do a live show. It is every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it's not, and if it's not, we'll tell you. That is a more conversational style. We sit there, we discuss things, we talk about what we've covered lately, and then very often you'll get kind of tangential conversations where we just talk about things we're interested in very passionately. So with all of that said, thank you very much for watching. I hope you check into the next ones. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.